What if the hardest part of divorce isn't losing your partner, but losing the version of yourself you once believed in? Sebastian sat in the dim light of his living room, the weight of solitude pressing against his chest. The house was quiet, too quiet. It had been months since the divorce, but the silence still unsettled him. There were no footsteps echoing down the hallway, no distant hum of another presence, no sharp words slicing through the air like before. Only stillness, only him. He glanced at the empty seat across from him at the kitchen table. For years that seat had been occupied by his ex-wife, Samantha. He could still picture her there, scrolling through her phone, indifferent to his presence. It was strange how the absence of something could feel heavier than its presence. Sebastian rubbed his temples. He should feel relieved. No more tension, no more walking on eggshells. And yet, as much as he had wanted to escape the toxic cycle of his marriage, he wasn't sure if he had truly escaped anything. Because no matter how far he got from Samantha, her words still lingered in his head. "You're too sensitive, Sebastian. You always overthink things." He leaned back against the couch, exhaling slowly. The truth was, he had spent so long trying to keep his marriage from falling apart that he never stopped to ask himself a simple question: at what cost? As he stared at the bookshelf across the room, his eyes landed on something tucked between the old novels. A leather-bound journal. He hadn't touched it in years. His heart clenched. He knew exactly what was inside. Pages filled with thoughts he had never spoken out loud. Memories, observations, things he had written when he had started feeling like something was off but couldn't quite put his finger on it. For a long time, he had convinced himself those pages were just exaggerated emotions, passing frustrations. But now, with the clarity that only divorce could bring, he wondered if the truth had been staring back at him all along. His fingers hesitated over the journal's spine. Did he really want to open it? Sebastian swallowed hard. Maybe it was time to stop running from his own memories. The journal felt heavier than it should have, its leather cover cool beneath his fingertips. He traced the edges before finally flipping it open. The first page was dated nearly 6 years ago, before the divorce, before the exhaustion, before he understood what had been happening to him. "Samantha and I had another argument tonight. I don't even know what it was about anymore. Every time I try to talk, she twists my words until I feel like the villain. Maybe I should stop bringing things up. Maybe I'm making it worse." Sebastian let out a bitter laugh. God, I was blind. He had written those words in a moment of self-doubt, convinced that if he just tried harder, loved better, fixed himself, then everything would be okay. But it never was. Flipping through the pages, he saw it all. Patterns he had ignored, warnings he had dismissed. There were notes about the nights she gave him the silent treatment, the way she minimized his feelings, the way she made him question his own reality. She said, "I always make her the bad guy." But all I wanted was to be heard. Sebastian clenched his jaw. He had spent years convincing himself that love meant sacrifice, that compromise meant swallowing his pain to keep the peace. And yet, the words on the page told a different story. "She called me dramatic today when I told her I felt like she didn't care. I don't think I was being dramatic, but maybe she's right." A lump formed in his throat. This was how it had started. Not with cruelty, not with screaming, but with doubt. A slow, insidious unraveling of his confidence, of his trust in his own perception. For years, he had rewritten reality to make it more bearable. He had told himself she was just stressed, that all couples had rough patches, that if he just loved her enough, she would change. But love had never been the problem. Sebastian set the journal down, his pulse steady but heavy. He had spent so much time mourning the loss of his marriage, but maybe he had been mourning the wrong thing. Maybe what hurt most wasn't the divorce itself, but the realization that he had abandoned himself long before she ever left. And if that was true, then the real question wasn't, why did she treat me this way? It was, why did I let her? Sebastian exhaled, closing the journal. His hands trembled slightly, but he didn't look away. For the first time in a long time, he was ready to face the truth. The journal sat untouched on the table for days. He didn't need to open it again. Its words had already embedded themselves into his thoughts, resurfacing at odd moments. While washing dishes, while folding laundry, while lying in bed staring at the ceiling, it was as if every page had unlocked a door inside him, forcing him to step into rooms he had avoided for years. But what came after the truth? Sebastian glanced around his house. His house. For years, it had been theirs. But now, it was only his. No more misplaced cappuccino cups left on the counter. No more perfume lingering in the air. No more tension curling in the corners of the room like an unspoken threat. Just silence. And God, it was deafening. At first he tried to fill it. He turned on the television for background noise, played music while he cooked, scrolled through his phone endlessly. Anything to distract himself. But the thing about silence was that it always found a way back in. Loneliness was a strange thing. It didn't hit all at once. It crept in gradually, disguising itself as something manageable until one day it settled in your bones. Sebastian had never been the type to crave social interactions. But this was different. This wasn't solitude by choice. This was emptiness. The people in his life had stopped checking in as often. In the beginning, there were the usual texts. How are you holding up? Do you want to get out of the house? But eventually, people moved on. His divorce had been messy, and when a marriage ended, people often felt the need to choose sides. Some of them chose Samantha. Others just didn't know what to say to him anymore. And honestly, he didn't blame them. He didn't know what to say to himself either. Late one evening, Sebastian made an attempt to break the monotony. He forced himself to go out, to be among people, to remember what it felt like to exist outside these walls. He ended up at a bar, not to drink heavily, just to be somewhere else. But as he sat at a small table, nursing a whiskey, he realized how out of place he felt. He wasn't the same man he used to be. The laughter around him felt foreign. The flirtation between strangers at the bar counter, the casual conversations between friends, it all belonged to a world he no longer understood. He left before finishing his drink. That night, as he lay in bed, he finally admitted something to himself. He wasn't just lonely, he was lost. And for the first time, he wondered if he had ever really known who he was outside of being someone's husband. The knock at his door startled him. He wasn't expecting anyone. When he opened it, he found his old friend Liam, standing there with a six-pack of beer and a knowing look in his eyes. "Figured you could use some company," Liam said, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. Sebastian sighed but didn't protest. He wasn't in the mood for small talk, but something about Liam's presence was grounding. They had known each other since college, before marriages, before careers, before life had made things complicated. They sat in the living room, the television playing in the background, neither of them really watching. "How are you holding up?" Liam finally asked. Sebastian huffed out a laugh. "You're the first person to ask me that in weeks." Liam took a sip of his beer. "That's because people don't know how to deal with divorce. It makes them uncomfortable. They act like it's contagious." Sebastian nodded, swirling his drink absent-mindedly. "Yeah. Or they assume I should be moving on by now." Liam gave him a long look. "And are you?" Sebastian hesitated. "I don't know how." Silence stretched between them before Liam leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I was there, man. I saw how she treated you. I saw how much you gave and how little she gave back." Sebastian's chest tightened. "I let it happen." "You didn't let it happen," Liam corrected. "You just didn't want to believe it was happening. There's a difference." Sebastian swallowed hard. "I ignored so many signs. I thought if I just held on a little longer, if I was patient enough, if I loved her enough, that she'd change." Liam finished for him. Sebastian nodded. Liam exhaled, shaking his head. "People don't change unless they want to. And Samantha never wanted to. She just wanted control." Sebastian looked away. "I guess I just didn't want to be alone." Liam was quiet for a moment before saying, "Maybe that's the real thing you need to figure out. It's not just about her, Seb, it's about you. Why did you hold on so tightly to something that was breaking you?" Sebastian had no answer. Later that night, after Liam left, Sebastian found himself staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. He looked tired, older. like someone who had survived something but wasn't sure what to do with the survival. Why had he held on? Was it because he loved her? Or was it because, deep down, he didn't believe he was worthy of something better? Sebastian turned off the bathroom light and walked away. The answers weren't easy, but for the first time, he was starting to ask the right questions. Sebastian sat on the edge of his bed, fingers tapping rhythmically against his knee. The conversation with Liam had stirred something deep inside him, something uncomfortable, something he had spent months avoiding. The question lingered in his mind like an echo that refused to fade. Why did you hold on so tightly to something that was breaking you? He didn't have an answer. Instead, he had memories. And memories, as much as he tried to bury them, had a way of clawing their way back to the surface. With a deep breath, Sebastian got up and walked toward the closet. There, tucked away in the corner, was a small wooden box he hadn't touched since the divorce. His hands trembled as he pulled it down and set it on the bed. Inside were remnants of a life he no longer belonged to. Old photos, birthday cards, small notes Samantha had written him in the early days. He picked up a Polaroid from their honeymoon, his younger self smiling at the camera, while Samantha leaned into him. Back then, he thought love was supposed to hurt sometimes. That relationships were about endurance, about proving your loyalty by staying through the worst of it. He had told himself that rough patches were normal, that all couples argued, that her coldness wasn't intentional, it was just stress, or exhaustion, or something he had done wrong. But looking at the photo now, he could see it. The distance in her eyes, even in the beginning, the way her smile never quite reached her face. Maybe the truth had always been there, hiding in plain sight. He sifted through more photos, each one carrying a memory, a moment, a reminder of what he had tried so hard to preserve. There was the anniversary dinner where she spent more time on her phone than talking to him, the weekend getaway where she criticized everything he planned, the birthday party where he felt more like a guest than a husband. Sebastian clenched his jaw. He had built his life around a woman who had never truly seen him, and the worst part? He had let her. His fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper at the bottom of the box. He hesitated before unfolding it. It was a note from Samantha, written in the early years of their marriage. Seb, you think too much. Just let things go. Not everything needs to be so serious. He exhaled sharply. That was the story of their relationship, wasn't it? Him feeling everything too much, and her feeling nothing at all. Sebastian closed the box and shoved it back into the closet. He didn't need to keep these reminders anymore. They weren't proof of love. They were proof of how much he had ignored himself in the name of it. As he lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, a new thought took root. What if the real healing wasn't in understanding why he stayed? What if it was in finally learning how to leave, mentally, emotionally, fully? The morning air was crisp as Sebastian stepped outside, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. It had been weeks since he had taken a walk, really walked, without rushing, without a destination, without feeling like the world was pressing in on him. The streets felt different, or maybe he did. Divorce had a strange way of distorting time. Some days, it felt like he had been alone forever. Other days, it felt like he had just signed the papers yesterday. The truth was, he was still adjusting, still figuring out what this new version of his life looked like. As he passed a Starbucks, the scent of fresh vanilla latte and baked goods filled the air. He hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. It had been years since he had gone to a restaurant alone. Samantha had never liked them. She preferred upscale brunch spots or places with a scene. But Sebastian had always loved the quiet hum of coffee shops, the way people lost themselves in books or conversations or their own thoughts. He ordered a black coffee and found a seat by the window. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't in a rush to be anywhere. And that realization hit him harder than he expected. His life had always been about someone else, about making sure Samantha was happy, about tiptoeing around her moods, about keeping the peace. But now, his time was his own. Sebastian took a slow sip of tea, letting the warmth spread through him. He watched as people passed by outside, lovers walking hand in hand, a mother pushing a stroller, an elderly man reading a newspaper at the next table. Life was still happening, still moving forward. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for him to move forward too. His phone buzzed on the table, breaking his thoughts. It was Liam. "Hey, we should get together this weekend. Something different. No sitting around talking about the past. Let's just live a little." Sebastian stared at the message. For months, his life had been about processing the past, the pain, the loss. But Liam was right. At some point, the only way to truly heal was to stop looking back and start living forward. He typed out a response. "Yeah, let's do it." As he finished his espresso, he allowed himself to imagine a future where his life wasn't defined by his divorce. A future where he wasn't just surviving, but living. Sebastian stood in front of his bathroom mirror, staring at his own reflection. For months, he had avoided looking too closely. There was something unnerving about facing himself, really seeing himself after the divorce. It wasn't just about the lines on his face that seemed deeper, or the way exhaustion lingered in his eyes. It was about the person behind those features. Who was he now? For years, he had been Samantha's husband. He had measured his days by her moods, structured his life around keeping the peace. And when it was all over, when the papers were signed, when the door had closed for the last time, he had no idea how to exist outside of that role. But now, something was different. He wasn't just surviving the divorce anymore, he was emerging from it. Sebastian took a deep breath and turned away from the mirror. Today was going to be different. The afternoon sun was warm against his skin as he walked into the bookstore. He hadn't planned on coming here. It was a spontaneous decision, one he wouldn't have made a few months ago. But spontaneity was something he was learning to embrace. As he wandered through the aisles, he felt a quiet sense of peace. There was no rush, no one waiting for him at home, no one demanding his time or energy. It was his time. His eyes landed on a self-help section. He almost laughed at the irony. He had always rolled his eyes at books about healing and self-discovery. But maybe there was something to be said for learning from those who had walked this path before him. He picked up a book titled "Starting Over: Life After Divorce." He hesitated for a moment before tucking it under his arm. Maybe it was time to stop pretending he had all the answers. As he moved toward the cashier, a woman passed by him, flipping through a novel. She caught his eye briefly, offering a small, polite smile before returning to her book. It was nothing, a simple, fleeting moment. But for the first time in a long time, Sebastian felt something other than loss. It wasn't attraction, it wasn't longing, it was possibility. That evening, he sat on his balcony, sipping a glass of wine. He'd always thought solitude would feel heavy, like an unbearable weight pressing down on him. But tonight, it didn't. Tonight, it felt light. Maybe divorce hadn't broken him. Maybe it had freed him. The pain, the regret, the self-doubt, those things had been real. They had shaped him. But they didn't have to define him. For the first time, he understood something that had eluded him for months. Divorce wasn't just an ending, it was an invitation to rediscover himself, to let go of the person he had been forced to become, to create a life that was no longer dictated by someone else's needs. And for the first time since it all fell apart, Sebastian didn't feel lost. He felt ready to move forward, ready to build something new, ready to live on his own terms. The night air was cool against his skin, but inside he felt warm, whole. He wasn't just healing from divorce. He was becoming himself again.